Okay, welcome to the study hall for December 26th. As mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we have a continuation of the content from last time, some sentences containing initial modifiers. So we've just finished going over the rules, and we are going to get started on the problems. So just the disclaimer, copyright, all of the problems that follow are from the GMAT Prep software, which is the free product from GMAC, the creator of the GMAT content. This is free content, so it can be distributed per their permission as long as we attach this copyright notice to it. And again, don't forget, if you submit problems from GMAT Prep, please make sure you're submitting problems from the free portion of GMAT Prep and not from the paid question packs, because the paid question packs are also, we also are not allowed to reproduce those here. Don't forget, if you have a multiple choice question, don't forget where to respond to it, which would be there. So let's go ahead and get started with this one. Here's a timer for you. Go for it. And we still have a couple of people who don't have answers to this, so I'll wait about 5 or 10 more seconds for that. Remember, the GMAT is a test where you have to answer all the things, so please pick something. Okay, so just to recap what the theme of today is. Theme of today is sentences with initial modifiers. So let's make sure we know what that is. So I'll use some of the same examples that we used to introduce this topic last time in the previous study hall. So here is an example sentence. Maybe familiar from you if you watched the last study hall session, but coming home from school, the wind blew me off my bike. Okay, so this sentence is incorrect. Does anybody want to tell me why? Like, what's wrong with that? Right, so if you look at the sentence, it does start out with this construction right here. That's a modifier. Remember what modifier is. It's not a complete sentence. It doesn't have a subject and a verb of its own. This is a modifier. It starts a sentence. So initial just meaning it's at the beginning. So modifier at the beginning. And then coming home from school pretty clearly has to describe a thing or person. Like, it's not just a thing that describes actions, because it's someone or something has to be coming home from school. So the way these modifiers work when they have to describe things is they describe whatever is closest to them by default. So that modifier there, basically whether you like it or not, that modifier describes what's next to it. So in this sentence, the obvious intended meaning of this sentence is that I was on my way home from school when the wind knocked me off my bike. But unfortunately, according to this sentence, the wind was the thing that was coming home from school. So it doesn't make any sense. Does the wind go to school? No, it doesn't. So wrong. Okay. Yeah, so depending on, okay, like some of you guys are fixing the sentence in the chat box. the most important thing I can tell you about fixing sentences is that you shouldn't do it. Because remember, that's not part of the skill set involved here. Like this particular sentence is not super hard to fix because you would just, if you had to leave coming home from school alone, you would just put I here. So coming home from school, like I was blown off my bike by the wind. But remember that fixing the sentences is not really a skill set that you have to have. So, and on top of it, fixing sentences is a much more difficult skill set than just pointing out things that are wrong. So I would suggest that you not worry about trying to, quote, fix, unquote, the sentences. But yeah, just make sure you know what's wrong with them. So what's wrong with this sentence is that it suggests that the wind was coming home from school. So if we take that into this example here, there you go. So although they are more temperamental and far more expensive than transistor-driven amplifiers, well, this is not, technically speaking, a modifier, because this is actually, starting with they here, this is actually a complete sentence. But even when you're not technically dealing with a modifier, if you have any sort of language that refers to another thing, so language that needs to refer to another concept, even if it's not strictly a modifier, should still be placed as close as possible to the referent. So anything that refers to anything else here either, right? So like there is a reference here. It's not, grammatically speaking, it's not strictly a modifier because it's not a piece of a sentence. Like it actually has a subject and verb and it's like a complete sentence linked by although. But what is more temperamental and far more expensive than transistor-driven amplifiers? Yeah, the other kinds of amplifiers, right? So the orange text, the orange box text in a sentence refers to the orange text, refers to the other kind of amplifiers. So you should put the other kind of amplifiers as close as you can. So because, I mean, there's a little, it's just unclear what's going on in the other sentences when you don't do that. So many audiophiles and audio professionals, not so much, because they are not temperamental. Many audiophiles and audio professionals, again, they could be, maybe they're very temperamental people, but that's not the point of the sentence. And then warmer, richer tones are also not temperamental. So what's temperamental and expensive are the other amplifiers, that. As far as the difference between D and E, what it comes down to is the way they do those things differently. So what's the difference between those two? Let's take a look. Look at what's highlighted in yellow here. That differs from the location of that and the location of that are different. And then correspondingly the location of this and the location of this are different. And one thing, by the way, I might as well address this while we're looking at this problem here. One complaint that we hear from a lot of students is that it's not very easy to find splits in these problems. But, like when they rearrange a lot of words. But if they rearrange a lot of words, it's still not that bad to find splits. You just want to find the items that correspond to each other in the sentence. So, for instance, this whole thing of by audiophiles and audio professionals, I mean, these two green things clearly match each other. So you can consider the placement of that as an issue. Same thing with the yellow things. The placement of the yellow things is also an issue. So just don't forget that splits includes, the whole concept of splits includes the idea of moving things around every bit as much as it includes the idea of replacing things with other things. So this is a general tip. When you look for splits, you should look for two types of splits, which are, number one, actual substitution of different things, or number two, movement of the same things. You know, like these yellow things, these green things here. So as far as where should we put this, well, what does the green thing go with? Like the green thing is the second half of something. By many audiophiles and audio pros. What's the first half of that? Yeah, that describes the preference, right? So they are preferred by those people. So, and again, I mean, there's a very general concept that you want to think about here, which is that things that go together should be, as much as possible, placed together. I mean, it's a very, very general principle here. I mean, notice how much ground can be covered by that. I mean, most modifiers ultimately come down to placing things next to what they're describing. The initial modifier has the same point, right, if you want to have it next to what it actually describes. And in general, a lot of stuff, right? So preferred blah, 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 blah by many audiophiles and audio professionals. There's no reason to split that up. So versus in E, it's not split up. Preferred and by many audiophiles and audio pros are directly next to each other. So the placement in E elephant is better. So it wins. The class didn't have too much trouble with this problem, so unless someone has a question, we can move on. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in the box. And miscellaneous. Yeah, you know, I mean, when it comes to these sentences, I don't think I've ever seen one that is like false. I mean, this sentence is saying not that they're preferred in general. I mean, this is just saying that some people who are hardcore about music prefer these things. You know, and the same kind of people who would prefer to play an album on a vinyl record versus a CD because they think the sound is more pure. So it's kind of like that. I wouldn't call it a reference. I would just say, I mean, it's just two halves of something. You know, it's kind of like if you have more X than Y, then the more and than those are two halves of something. In general, they're two pieces of the same construction. So it's not, it's not really a modifier. I don't want to get too deep into trying to classify this stuff because, number one, I don't know how anyway. But number two, as long as you know that these two green things are a team, that's all you have to know. I mean, again, one thing you really, really want to not do here is classify everything in the world. Like, that will just make that will make this impossibly difficult for you. Because, I mean, you just don't have to do it. They just want you to notice which pieces of the puzzle go with which other pieces of the puzzle, that's all. Any questions? Okay, let's move on to another problem. How about that? Give that a shot. Here's a timer. Go for it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, there are still a lot of people who don't have answers here. So, if you got to pick something in the next 10 or 15 seconds, please. Thanks. Okay, so there's still a couple people who don't have answers selected. If that's you, then just remember the test doesn't let you do that. But here are your answers from this problem. So we've got some spike here at choice D, but there's definitely a lot of opinion to be had about this problem. So let's talk about it. How do you pick answers? Okay, the answer choices. If you mean how do you literally select an answer choice, those are located here. So underneath your name, there's that letter A thing, and if you click the letter A thing underneath your name, then there's letters there. Okay, so let's talk about it. All right, so again, the example that we opened with here was coming home from school, the wind blew me off my bike. By the way, the other thing, I know I've mentioned this in lots of previous sessions, but this is one of those things that can definitely never be mentioned enough, which is that examples are the way that you should learn this stuff. So remembering examples is the ideal way of learning, because then you can just make analogies to those examples when you see anything unfamiliar. So, on the other hand, trying to remember actual rules in the form of a rule is bad. I mean, our brains are not wired to do that. I mean, especially not with language. Like if you think about the way that you learn your first language at home, whatever that language is, it's definitely not rules. Like when you're growing up learning to speak, the total number of rules that you learn is almost certainly 0 rules. It's almost certainly nothing to do with rules, and you're just exposed to tons and tons and tons of examples, and you remember those and you make analogies to them. So that's the way you want to learn this stuff too. So in other words, when you see this kind of thing, when you see this problem, you should think, okay, a decade after initiating the nation's most comprehensive smoking program, you should think, oh, hey, that's a lot like coming home from school. I mean, you don't need to think initial modifier or anything like that, and you most certainly don't know how to classify it. I don't know how to classify it either. But you should, when you see this, you should think, hey, that's like coming home from school. That's like coming home from school. The wind blew me off my bike. So in this case, instead of coming home from school, it's initiating this program a decade after initiating. Like, even if you have stuff like a decade after, that doesn't really change anything about the nature of the modifier. Because if I said while coming home from school or after coming home from school, those would still need to have the right person after them just as much as this one would. So the question boils down to who initiated, who or what initiated the nation's most comprehensive anti-smoking program. So what's the answer to that? Like, what needs to come after this? Yeah, right, the state of California. I mean, you basically have options here to pick from. I mean, if the question in your mind should be who or what entity initiated the anti-smoking program. So, sure. And your choices for that basically are the per capita consumption of cigarettes, California's annual per capita consumption of cigarettes, or the state of California. So, I mean, among those 3 different options, it should be pretty clear that it has to be California. I mean, there are other ways that conceivably that you could write that, like California legislators or the California Department of Health or whatever, right? But the point is that it has to be someone or some entity that could reasonably have started a program like that. So, okay, so that's California, and we're down to D and E. So since so many people picked answers that were not D or E, let's go ahead and re-vote. I'll give you like 20 more seconds. And then I want you to pick either D or E with the same multiple choice answers. Go for it. Remember, that's where you find the options. It may take a little longer, but not too much longer. Okay, so we still have a few non-responders, but here is what is happening at the moment. Now we got most people picking D, dog. A few people picking E, and a few non-responders. Let's take a look. Well, let's look at splits here. One thing you may have noticed is that E says per person and D doesn't say that. Did anybody go anywhere with that? Because remember that any difference here can trigger, yeah, you already have per capita, right? Per capita means per person. So you don't want to have both of those. Right, you could say the consumption rate, like the rate of consumption or just the consumption itself. So the rate of consumption was X cigarettes per capita or per person. That's one way to say it. Or you can say the rate of consumption of cigarettes was the per capita rate of consumption was X cigarettes. And this is also annual. I mean, you're going to have a per year or annual in there somewhere. So no, Nadia, that actually makes E incorrect. I mean, you don't say both. You don't say per capita and also per person. For the same reason you don't have an annual salary per year, or you don't give a free gift to someone. You just give them a gift. You don't receive an added bonus. You just get a bonus, and so on, like redundant construction. So okay, that's one way to eliminate E. And then also, and I mean the reason why these examples are so easy to come up with is because spoken language is absolutely full of redundancy. I mean, that's one thing. There are differences in what is effective when it comes to spoken and written language. Because in spoken language, redundancy is one of the most effective ways to convey a point. You know, like if I say, hey, you need to watch the last 3 things at the end of this show, people will get it. It'll be a very effectively conveyed message. But if I wrote down, you need to watch the last 3 things at the end, then that would be redundant because the last things are all, last and at the end are the same. So, same sort of thing. So, now, we'll get to that too. So let's talk about this. So the other difference between these two choices is the way they express that part. So in choice E, this actually creates 2 issues. The first issue is that we're talking about the delta. I mean, it should be clear from context that we're talking about, because I mean, we're talking about initiating an aggressive anti-smoking program. So like this is not going to mean twice as much as people smoke on average in the country, because then the sentence would be nonsense. Like if the sentence wanted to say that, then we would need but, or even though there was this program, people still smoke twice as much. But what we're trying to say is that it went down more than twice as much as smoking went down in other states. So here, because these words don't actually say a drop, they just say they went from this number to that number, we actually have to specify that it's the drop that is more than twice as great. And then the other issue, which another poster pointed out here, is now we have something for this to stand for. Because this word that here has to stand for a noun. So that is the drop. So if you look at E, both of these things are wrong, right? The first thing is that we don't have anything for that to stand for, except for consumption. But then if it stood for consumption, the sentence doesn't make sense. Like, in context, that must stand for decrease or drop or something like that. So you don't have that noun here. And then the other problem is, again, more than twice as great seems to suggest that the number 60 itself, which is the number of cigarettes that people are smoking in California, is that it makes you seem to think that people in the rest of the U.S. are smoking less than 30 packs, which is kind of not what the point of the sentence is. All right, and Ed, you're welcome. Okay, if you have any other questions about this problem, again, the main focus of today is for you to immediately recognize this initial modifier. Like when you see a decade after initiating yada, 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 blah, 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 then you should immediately think, okay, this is coming home from school. The wind blew me off my bike, kind of thing. So, any questions about that? Okay, excellent. So let's look at, is that one of those signs that we should? Well, the word that has a lot of uses. I mean, if you see the word that randomly in a sentence, then more often than not, it will not be this kind of that. I mean, the word that has all sorts of different ways that you can use it. So, I mean, just think about the way that I used it right there. There's a lot of ways that can be used. Or, you know, I said that this was going to happen. So, I mean, really, you should just start your reasoning from splits and go from there. So, if we notice the lack of the word dropped here, then it has results for the word that. But I wouldn't necessarily say that you need to always focus on it. But if you see it used as a pronoun like this, it probably does deserve your attention in the sense that when the word that is used as a pronoun, it's commonly tested because it's a concept that's easy enough to test. It's a pretty straightforward concept. Okay, what is the noun, and is the noun there? And also, it's a good concept to test in the sense that it doesn't favor speakers of whatever language. So if you see the word that used as a pronoun, you may want to pay attention to it after you look at things that are explicit splits. Okay. Let's look at another one. This one's shorter, so I'll give you less time. Here's less time. Don't forget where your answer choices are located. Okay, my mic shut itself off, thank you. Okay, so where I was going with this was these opening words here, there's a family of openers that are like that don't affect the rest of the sentence at all. Like, if a sentence opens with, it is possible that, or people believe that, or studies have shown that, or something along those lines, then you can actually just ignore it. In fact, these sentences can be, I mean, these pieces can be stuck. These pieces can be glued to the front of any sentence in the entire world. So, in other words, they don't really affect the following sentence at all. For instance, it is possible that these pieces can be glued to the front of any sentence in the whole world. People believe that these pieces can be glued to the front of any sentence in the whole world. Studies have shown that these pieces can be glued to the front of any sentence in the whole world. So those parts, you honestly just don't care. I mean, you should still think about the meaning of them and think about whether it's, like, if the word possible is interacting with other things, then, you know, you would, because, for example, if you saw it is possible that something can happen, then that would be a redundant construction. But other than that, in terms of the grammar and construction of the sentence, it is possible that doesn't affect anything. So if we can just ignore that, so boom, it's gone. All right. Like the Volkswagen, so pretend there's a capital L there now. I mean, it is subjective, right? The sentence is expressing something that is unknown. So it probably does have a subjective feel. At least it has the feel of a conjecture or a scientific hypothesis. Okay, like the Volkswagen, who blah, 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 blah. This is also a modifier. So we don't, in terms of the structure of the whole sentence, we don't need to pay attention to it. So, hey, it's like coming home from school again. Like the Volkswagen, comma, blank. Just imagine there's a blank there. So, like the Volkswagen, however they actually pronounce it for real. Like the Volkswagen. So what goes in that blank? Well, what is like the Volkswagen here? All right, well, you have to read the sentence a little bit carefully because it's not a comparison between two cars. But yeah, it's the bacterium that they're talking about, right? Because they're saying that the Volkswagen has looked the same for all these generations. Like the Beetle still looks basically the way that it looked in the 60s. So the exterior of the thing has not really changed, even though the insides. Yeah, the part that I crossed out, there's a reason why I actually completely concealed this part and just drew a thin line through that part. Because in this part is totally irrelevant as far as the sentence structure goes. Whereas the purple cross out is irrelevant as far as overall structure, but it does contribute. I mean, obviously it contributes to the meaning of the sentence. So, okay. But like the Volkswagen is not like the sheets, because the sheets are more like the exterior of the car. So, and I mean, make sure that you, just as a reminder, when you read the sentence, the only thing you should be thinking about at all is meaning. So, like this, concerning yourself with figuring this out exactly should be the only thing that you do when you read the sentence. So remember, comma, exclamation point, comma. When you read the sentence, you should think only about meaning / context. Do not think about mechanics yet. So understand exactly what is going on. Whatever words or constructions are there, make sure you understand precisely what they're supposed to be doing, and so on. So like, for instance, when you see this sentence, you should think, okay, comparison. And before you proceed any further with this, you should determine exactly what is being compared to what, which is really just thinking about context. I mean, the structure is not going to reveal that to you. It's going to be like, let me just use common sense here and see what they're telling me. So the question is exactly what is compared. Well, I mean, the deal is that they're comparing the car to the microbes, and then the sheath, the unchanging exterior of the car, is what compares to the sheath of the microbe. So if you did not 100% figure that out, you should not have gone on to the answer choices until you did. Like if it takes you a decently long amount of time to establish this, then take a decently long amount of time and establish it. Because you can't let yourself plod through the answer choices with an uncertain understanding. If you do not understand exactly what the content of the sentence is trying to say, then don't move on until you do. Okay, so like the car, turns out you can spend all the time you want figuring this out, because as long as you figure it out, you're done. Like the car, the evolution, well, no. Like the car, the evolution, well, Like the car, no significant mod, no. Like the car, the exterior of the microbe, well, no. Closer, but still no. And then like the car, the microbes, look at that, we're done. Boom, end of story. Any questions about this one? The evolution could explain. Yeah, I mean, that's the overall context, but again, it doesn't substantiate a comparison. I mean, what you're saying there is, in our original example, and what you're saying there is kind of like, you know, because I am in here somewhere, that it describes that. If you don't know that a Volkswagen is a car, I mean, you probably know that a Volkswagen is a car. But even if you don't, even if you have no idea what a Volkswagen is, I mean, let's say you honestly had no idea what a Volkswagen is. Even if you read the sentence, it says, like, let me take Volkswagen and replace it with, because these sentences aren't going to require, I mean, exotic knowledge. I mean, Volkswagen is not what I would call exotic knowledge, because, I mean, you know, just about everybody knows what that is. But on the off chance that you don't know what that is, if I replace this with, it's not just noun to noun. That's not good enough, because the sheath is also a noun. So you have to understand context. But if I replace this with, I don't know, some nonsense thing like XX244QJ3, I mean, nobody knows what an XX244QJ3 is because I just made it up. But if you read the sentence, you have enough context where you don't care. You can still understand. Like, whatever an XX244QJ3 is, it's obviously a thing that has looked the same on the outside for many years, but has changed on the inside. So, I mean, that information is enough to, that information right there is enough to establish that we're comparing it to the whole bacterium and not just the sheath of it. So, because whatever this X244 thing is, the whole thing is what the comparison is, not just the exterior part. And as far as the original comparison goes, like X has to be next to the thing that is like X. I mean, there's not really room for negotiating there. So just make sure you understand that. Many historic microbes. Anna, if you're asking a question, I'm not exactly sure what question you're asking. But, okay. All right. Why does it start that way? Why does it start what way? Not sure what you mean by why does it start that way. Well, because that's what the sentence is talking about. It's like saying that, you know, a lot of ancient bacteria evolved kind of like Volkswagen did. I mean, that's what the sentence is about. I mean, I guess I still don't really understand your question, because it would be like if I told you Ron is 5 feet 10 inches tall. Your question is kind of like, why does that sentence start with Ron? Or unless I'm missing something. But I mean, if it's the comparison part, if you're just asking about the initial modifier comparison part, the whatever has to compare with those bacteria, and maybe that's what you're asking. Because that's what the bacteria are, the things that are like the whatever Volkswagen XX244QJ3 thing. So if that's the point. Nadia, that was a discussion with the brown part, but the short version of that discussion is, in terms of the rest of the sentence, you can totally ignore things like this. Although, if the words in these things like interact with the rest of the sentence, then you might have to think about it. Like, for instance, people believe that doesn't affect the grammar of the rest of the sentence at all, but if some redundant word is in there, like belief, like people believe this belief, then it's going to be redundant. Or like, it is possible that you can cross out, but if it says something like could or can later in the sentence, then you don't want possible as well as could. So, I mean, in other words, in terms of structure, yes, you can completely ignore these things, but in terms of how they interact with the meaning of the rest of the words, maybe not. Okay. Other questions, fire away. If not, we'll look at another one. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at that one. More words means more time. So here's a little bit more time. Go for it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't have an answer selected yet, please pick one. Okay. I see somebody didn't see the problem on the board, but the person who didn't see it has actually been kicked out of the room, so, internet problems. Yeah, okay, let's talk about it here. So, well, introduced by Italian merchants resident in London during the 16th century. When you guys see stuff like this, if it's in the part of the sentence that is correct for sure, like the non-underlined part, I mean, you know, the writing of these sentences is not going to be incorrect. I mean, in some cases it'll be in a style that you haven't seen before, but it is certainly not going to be wrong. So, like, don't question what you see. Don't question the writing of the official problems, because it's a waste of your time to do that. Instead, just learn, right? just learn that certain things are okay if you didn't already know. So, I mean, in this case, resident is, I mean, a resident of a place can be a person, like a noun. But resident in a certain area could also be a description of a person. Like, it's different from residing somewhere in the sense that merchants, people who are resident in a specific area are basically not, they're settled there. I mean, they're basically not going anywhere anytime soon. So this is like, you can take this word out and put settled here. Versus residing somewhere, you might just be there overnight, or even like just for a month or something. So, in fact, in English, if you say that someone is residing somewhere, you're actually implying that they're really not going to be there for very long. So you wouldn't say that you're residing in a place where you're going to spend the rest of your life. So, are initial modifiers common in the GMAT? Well, there are certainly enough of them to make them worth having a study hall. So that's the best way I can answer that. All right, so let's talk about this. Introduced by these merchants, comma, which is a lot like coming home from school. So it doesn't say what was introduced by merchants in London. So the sentence has to begin with whatever was actually introduced by merchants in London. So which would be what? What was introduced by Italian merchants in London? Yeah, life insurance was, right? So, yeah, so exactly. So introduced by Italian merchants in London, comma, blank. So that's going to have to be life insurance. Can't be anything else in context. So in terms of the options you have in England, and by the way, when GMAC has written these sentences, they have never ever allowed, like in terms of these initial modifiers, they have never allowed another modifier to intervene between the initial modifier and the subject. So be aware of that. So even sticking something like in England or until the end of the 17th, even that in the eyes of GMAC, at least as far as we've seen in previous problems, even that has been enough to justify elimination. So, YD, actually, okay. I mean, let me elaborate on that a little bit in another frame. So here is the deal. Okay, so let me just give you a more detailed explanation of what I've seen as far as this goes. So if, like, for this construction, initial modifier, comma, thing or person, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's talk about that. So the deal here is there's two things that you want to differentiate between. The first thing is that inserting stuff here has never been allowed by GMAC. So GMAC has never, ever, ever allowed anything to be inserted here. So for instance, if you had something like introduced by merchants in London, comma, I forget what it said, but in 1800 life insurance was. This is enough as far as we have seen from them to eliminate, because this is the initial modifier and introduced by merchants in London, comma, and then the in 1800 is stuck in the part after the comma. We haven't seen them do that. Now, what we have seen them do is if you have another thing that is actually part of the initial modifier, then that's a different story. So if you, in other words, if a further modifier, if further modifiers are inserted here so that they're still part of the initial modifier, then that's acceptable. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So like if you say in like during the first week of May, or like in held in the first week of May, the Kentucky Derby brings millions of people to Louisville. I mean, this is right, this is fine, but my point is that if I insert something in there, like held in the first week of May, a time when the weather is especially pleasant, the Kentucky Derby brings millions of people to Louisville. Okay, these sentences are both correct sentences. So because notice the way these are structured, this is not the same kind of thing that they're doing in the blue one. Because like, if you look at the first one there should be no issues with, right? The standard initial modifier, and then the Kentucky Derby is held in the first week of May, right? Now the point is that in the second one, you are not inserting something the way that you are in the blue thing. In the second one, you're actually, May, I guess is capitalized. In the second one, you're actually giving more detail about the first week of May. So meaning this entire thing is still one initial modifier. And I mean, if you were like coding this or something, you could draw parentheses, right? There would be like a set of parentheses around that entire thing. And then you could think of there being a further set of parentheses around this, which is a sub-description of the first week of May. So that's fine, because then you still, ultimately, this sentence is still the same as that one. Whereas with this example, it's not. Like in 1800 is not describing anything in the initial modifier. In 1800 is talking about later things. So this is fundamentally different, and so it's not okay. It's probably more explanation than you were bargaining for, but that's the point. So Nadia, I mean, there are plenty of ways to describe people without using the word who, but the one thing that is for sure is that you cannot use the word which or that to refer to a person. So, I mean, again, examples here would be good. Okay, so, and YD, that was the incredibly long-winded and overly thorough answer to that question. Okay, so, all right, yeah, held in the first week of May, right. Okay, so now let's talk about this. So we need life insurance in England. So, well, actually, if you think about this, you actually got two different things going on here. So introduced, it could be life insurance just in England, or it could be life insurance in general. I mean, both of those would make sense, so we can't really eliminate. But notice that D just says that English life insurance was introduced by these people, whereas E says that the entire idea of life insurance was invented by these people. So those are both things that make sense. So we can't eliminate either one of them. But there you go. Okay, so let's take a look. D versus E. So yeah, the next thing we'll look at is that idiom, right? So you have a split where that's an and, and that's a width. When you see that, you should think, what is it the second half of? Because I mean, these things don't, especially things like width, they don't really work in isolation, right? So what construction is that part of? Well, between people and other people, so that works. Between people with other people, it does not so much work. So that is and grounds for elimination of E. All right. Any questions? So D dog. It's like one or two people are typing, so thanks, I appreciate it. All right, we'll move on here in just a sec. Got time for at least one more, maybe two, depending on what it takes. Whoop, whoop. All right, I'll take that as a whoop, whoop for the awesome Louisville Cardinals who are going to win on Saturday. Okay, how about in England and E is, yeah, that's also a good point, what Ben Joseph just wrote in the chat box. Right, because in England seems to be attached to the end of the 17th century, which suggests, like, it suggests that there are different centuries in different countries, and that there was a certain century in England, right? I mean, because like that kind of thing would work with times of day, for instance. You know, like until midnight in New York, you can order these things at sale price. I mean, meaning that, you know, when it's midnight in New York, it's actually, I don't know, like 1 p.m. in China. So like that would make sense. But if it's the end of the 17th century in England, then it's also the end of the 17th century everywhere else in the world. So that's also a good point. But you can see, you can notice, I mean, if you're noticing anything and everything that is different, you can gather a lot of cool stuff in these problems. So Ben, thanks for that. Okay, let's look at another one. How about that one? Boom, go. Okay, most of you guys have answers to this. Not all of you do. So let's pick something that is a thing and go from there. All right, so let's talk about it. All right. So unlike something, so notice the way that they did this is different. Like in the previous examples that we've seen today, the initial modifier has been left intact, and you've had to choose what goes after it. But now, you know, I always wondered why they don't just put blanks in these sentences. I mean, because they reproduce choice A for you anyway. So honestly, for me personally, it would be a lot easier if they put a blank there, so that I could visualize stuff in the blank more easily. But alas, they don't. So, but you have unlike blank, comma, a permanently orbiting space station will have to do things. So the question is, what is like a permanently, or what is actually contrasted with a permanently orbiting space station? So what is contrasted with a permanently orbiting space station? Yeah, the shuttle and an earlier spacecraft, right? So it's got to be the shuttle and earlier spacecraft. So, I mean, spacecraft, by the way, is plural, although it's kind of like children or men or women. It's also singular, so it's actually more like fish or deer, like one fish or like 100 fish, one spacecraft or 100 spacecraft. But even if you weren't sure of that, then it's the shuttle and those things. So there's no question that it's plural. But just so you know, things like aircraft and watercraft and spacecraft are either singular or plural. So, okay. So we need the actual things that are being contrasted with the space station. So, i.e., not the flights, not the flights, not the flights. So those three choices are the incorrect wrongness of incorrectitude. Okay, that leaves us with B and D, boy and dog. So the shuttle and earlier spacecraft. So if you look at what is actually different between B and D, boy and dog, in fuel cells and batteries for their short flights is identical. And then you have this and this. So what's the only thing that you can use to decide here? Just that blue part. Does anybody notice a difference in that blue part? Yeah, right, sufficient and enough. I mean, you might notice that, oh, hey, look, the word enough is in one choice but not the other one. So let me think about, well, do I really need that word? So, because enough is in some of those choices and not in the other ones. So if you've got sufficient, you don't need it. Because just saying sufficient is enough. Ha ha ha. Look how I did that. All right, so sufficient and enough, no, it's kind of like annual per year or added bonus or free gift or continue onward or reply back or any of those things. Again, that's just one of those things that you have to, there are a few things in written English that you will be absolutely unprepared for as a result of spoken English. And one of those is redundancy, because again, when you speak, redundancy is not only permissible, but a lot of the time desirable. So you just have to recalibrate the entire way that you think about redundancy. But okay, so that leaves us with D, dog. So there you go, because everything else is the wrongness. I think D because it implied past tense and B is not. Yeah, they could write D with the present tense and it would still work. I mean, if they, like, in other words, they could write which are capable of, because I mean, if those things are still around, then there would be nothing wrong with speaking about them in the present tense. You know, like if, for example, if you were speaking about a World War II airplane, you would probably use the past tense, but if there still is one in a museum somewhere that can still be flown, then you could use the present tense. So, I don't think there's a problem with there. I mean, it's definitely not a mistake. It may be a little bit stylistically weird, but they don't really test stylistics. So no, you can't get rid of the answer just because B uses with. Does there need to be a verb? Not really. If you have, because I mean the main part of the sentence is the non-underlined part. A permanently orbiting space station will have to do this. Like all of the underlined part is part of the initial modifier. So you don't need a verb. I don't know what that means, Anshul. But whatever you're saying, I think the same is probably true of the correct answer too. So, we need it. Sure, that particular difference has never actually been tested on the exam, so I don't want to go into it too much, but no. I mean, the sentence is saying that all of those earlier spacecrafts had enough power in their batteries to do it. So in that case, the comma is what you want. So okay, let's move on. We can. I was a few minutes late here, so we can probably do one more before we have to break. So let's do one. Let's see. How about that one? All right, ladies and gentlemen. There's one or two of you who don't have an answer yet. So, I mean, remember, whenever we do these problems in any sort of organized way, like with a topic or a theme, you should be doing them faster than normal. Because when you do a problem that's random, you have to get oriented to it and figure out, you have no idea what's going to be tested. Whereas because today is initial modifiers day, I mean, you know for sure that there are going to be initial modifiers in the sentences. So just be aware of that. Okay, so let's talk about it. Let's just imagine a blank there. So let's just imagine that there are no words in the blank and you just have to fill it in. So unlike blank, H. Ross Perot's independent run for the presidency did something. So the question then becomes, what is compared to Perot's run for the presidency? Not Perot himself. So if you remember H. Ross Perot, he had very large ears. Yeah, it has to be someone else's run for president. I mean, you can't reasonably compare a person to someone else's presidential candidacy. So it's not going to be Wallace and Anderson. It's going to be those people. So it's going to be the presidential candidacies of Wallace and Anderson. So in other words, not A, B, or C, because that's not the right comparison. And then actually not D either, because those are still people. So that leaves us with E, elephant, and whoa, we're done. It's kind of cool. All right, well, that was a fast one. So that's it for today. We got to wrap it up here, but I hope everyone is having a safe and awesome Christmas season. We're actually going to have another one of these on the 2nd, which is a week from today. It's the first and probably only time we're ever going to have two of them in a row in consecutive weeks. But so January 2nd at the same time, there'll be one. But yeah, I mean, sometimes we do quant in this session. Sometimes, I mean, this session has no organized format. The topic is basically chosen at random from week to week. I'm going to go ahead and kill the recording of this. So good night and good luck.